Montana Territory, 1878. The scent of gunpowder still hung in the air over Timber Creek, a reminder of the frontier's unforgiving nature. Hank Prescott had seen enough of death at 25 to last several lifetimes. 3 years writing with the Montana Stockmen's Association had taught him one immutable truth: attachment was a liability in this untamed country. Love was a luxury that got men killed, distracted when they needed to be vigilant. The West demanded solitary men, wolves, not shepherds, and he'd adapted accordingly. The late summer sun beat down on his broad shoulders as he guided his sorrel gelding through the bustling Main Street. Despite his youth, the townspeople nodded respectfully as he passed. They recognized the confident posture, the ever-watchful eyes, and the well-worn colt on his hip. What they didn't see was the exhaustion that had settled deep in his bones, the weariness of a man who'd chosen a life without connections. "Heard you're heading out with the fall drive tomorrow," called Sam Wilson from the mercantile porch. "Need anything before you go?" Hank reined his horse to a stop, just the usual supplies. "Ammunition, coffee, tobacco." "Got a letter for you too," Sam added, disappearing inside before returning with a folded paper. "Came through with the stage yesterday." Hank took it with a nod, tucking it into his shirt pocket without looking at it. There were few people who'd write him, and fewer still whose words he wanted to read. Letters meant connections, and connections meant vulnerability. "Marshall wants to see you too," Sam added. Something about trouble up at the Alderson place. The Alderson Ranch, just the mention of it caused a tightening in his chest. He'd avoided that stretch of land for months now, ever since the old man had been laid to rest. Everyone knew the daughter had taken over operations, a foolish enterprise doomed to fail. Women didn't last long trying to run ranches alone in Montana Territory. The smart ones remarried quickly or sold out. "I'll stop by his office," Hank replied, touching the brim of his hat before nudging his horse forward. Marshall Thompson was waiting outside his office, gray mustache twitching as Hank approached. "Got rustlers hitting the North Valley," Thompson said without preamble. 3 ranches hit in the last week. The Alderson girl lost 15 head yesterday. "Send Daniels or Miller," Hank replied flatly. "I'm heading out with the drive tomorrow." Thompson's eyes narrowed. "I'm not asking, son. The association specifically requested you handle this. That Alderson spread is too valuable to let fail." "She should sell," Hank said, dismounting and tying his horse to the post. "It's too much land for one person to manage." "That one person is the most stubborn woman in the territory," Thompson chuckled, "and she's requested help specifically from you." The words landed like a physical blow. "Why me?" "Something about you being the only competent man with a gun in 3 counties, Thompson said with a wry smile. Her words, not mine. Hank frowned. He'd met Beatrice Alderson only twice, once at a town gathering before her father died, and once at the funeral. 22 years old, honey blonde hair always neatly pinned, and a composure that belied her years. She'd stood dry-eyed at her father's graveside while the rest of the mourners wept openly, her lavender dress a stark contrast to the sea of black surrounding her. "Fine," he finally conceded. "I'll ride out there today, but the association needs to find someone else. I won't be back from the cattle drive for 6 weeks." Thompson nodded. "Just see what you can do before you leave. That girl's out there alone except for 2 ranch hands, and they're barely more than boys themselves." Hank spent an hour gathering supplies before heading north out of town. The ride to the Alderson Ranch gave him too much time with his thoughts. He'd built his life around staying unencumbered, taking jobs that kept him moving. The longest he'd stayed anywhere since leaving home at 16 was the 3 years with the association, and even that involved constant travel, tracking rustlers, escorting cattle drives, and delivering justice too far from proper courts to matter. Attachment meant vulnerability. Vulnerability got you killed. His father had taught him that lesson when he'd watched Indians burn their homestead with his mother inside. His father had been too attached to their land, too stubborn to heed warnings. By the time Hank was 12, he was orphaned and hardened. The Alderson Ranch appeared on the horizon, a sprawling complex of buildings nestled in a verdant valley with mountains rising behind it. It was one of the oldest and most prosperous spreads in the territory, with prime grazing land and reliable water sources. Old Man Alderson had been a shrewd businessman, building his empire through equal parts diplomacy and determination. As Hank approached the main house, he saw her on the porch, rifle in hand. Beatrice Alderson wore a practical blue dress with the sleeves rolled up, her honey blonde hair partially escaping its pins after what had clearly been a long day of work. Despite this, she stood straight and confident, watching his approach with unwavering blue eyes. "Mr. Prescott," she called out as he drew closer. "I was beginning to think the marshal hadn't delivered my message." Hank dismounted, removing his hat. "Miss Alderson, I understand you've had some trouble." 15 head taken last night," she replied, lowering her rifle but not setting it aside. "Cut the fence line along the north pasture. Third time this month. The association is sending me out with the fall drive tomorrow. I don't have time to." "I don't need a lecture on the limitations of your schedule, Mr. Prescott," she interrupted. "I need someone who can track these men and put an end to it before I lose my entire herd." Her directness caught him off guard. Most women in the territory spoke to men with deference, particularly those in positions of authority. Beatrice Alderson spoke like someone accustomed to being heard. "I can spare today," he conceded. "Show me where they cut the fence." She nodded once, setting her rifle against the porch railing and stepping down. "I'll saddle my horse." "That won't be necessary, just point me in the right direction." Her eyes flashed with annoyance. "This is my ranch, Mr. Prescott. I'll do more than point." 15 minutes later, they were riding together along the northern boundary of her property. Beatrice sat confidently atop a sleek chestnut mare, keeping pace with Hank's larger gelding without difficulty. The silence between them was broken only by the occasional directions she provided. "There," she finally said, pointing to a section of fence where the wire had been cleanly cut. "They took the cattle through here and headed east toward the foothills." Hank dismounted to examine the cut. Clean work. Not amateurs, he knelt to study the tracks. 4 horses, heavily laden when they left. They knew what they were doing. "Can you track them?" He nodded, "but they've got at least 12 hours head start. Even if I find them, there's 4 of them and 1 of me." "And me," she added firmly. Hank stood, facing her directly. "Miss Alderson, I appreciate your determination, but this isn't work for a—" "If you say woman, Mr. Prescott, I will be sorely tempted to demonstrate how capable this woman is with the rifle currently strapped to my saddle." Despite himself, Hank felt the corner of his mouth twitch. "I was going to say ranch owner. These men are professionals. They won't hesitate to kill anyone who threatens their operation." "This ranch is all I have," she replied, her voice steady but with an undercurrent of emotion. "My father built it from nothing. I won't let it be picked apart piece by piece because men think I'm an easy target." Something in her words resonated with him. He recognized the fierce independence, the refusal to be seen as vulnerable despite overwhelming odds. It was like looking in a mirror, and the familiarity disturbed him. "We'll follow their trail," he finally said, "but we turn back at sundown whether we found them or not." "I have obligations tomorrow." "Agreed," she said, satisfaction evident in her tone. They rode east, following tracks that led into increasingly rugged terrain. Hank was impressed by Beatrice's riding skills and her knowledge of the landscape. She pointed out landmarks and alternative routes with the familiarity of someone who'd spent a lifetime exploring this land. "Your father taught you well," he observed as they navigated a steep incline. "My father taught me everything except how to get men to take me seriously," she replied without looking back. "That I've had to learn on my own." They stopped to rest the horses near a small stream around midday. As Beatrice knelt to fill their canteens, Hank surveyed the surrounding hills. "The tracks are fresher," he noted. "We're gaining on them." "Good," she said, standing and handing him a filled canteen. "My ranch hands said they've seen the same group of riders scouting our northern pastures for weeks. This isn't random." "Someone's targeting your ranch specifically," Hank agreed. "Any idea who might hold a grudge against your father?" "Or you?" She considered this while securing the canteen to her saddle. "Conrad Sullivan has been trying to buy our water rights for years. My father always refused." She turned to face him directly. "And 3 men have offered to buy the ranch since he died, each offering less than it's worth." "Vultures circling," Hank muttered. "Precisely," she nodded. "They assume a woman alone will panic and sell cheap." "And you won't." It wasn't a question, but she answered anyway. "This land is my legacy, Mr. Prescott. I'll defend it with my last breath if necessary." The conviction in her voice stirred something unexpected in Hank, admiration, certainly, but also a strange sense of kinship. He'd spent years avoiding such connections, viewing them as weaknesses, yet here was someone whose determination mirrored his own. They continued tracking into the afternoon, the trail leading them into a narrow canyon. Hank's instincts prickled as they entered the confined space. "We should turn back," he said quietly. "This is too perfect for an ambush." Beatrice opened her mouth to protest, but was cut off by the crack of a rifle. The bullet struck the rock face inches from her head. "Get down," Hank shouted, drawing his Colt as he lunged for her, pulling her from the saddle as their horses panicked. They tumbled behind a large boulder as more shots rang out. Pressed together behind their meager cover, Hank could feel Beatrice trembling slightly, though her expression remained determined. "Are you hit?" he asked urgently. "No," she replied, drawing a small revolver from her boot. "But I dropped my rifle when the horses bolted." Hank peered around the edge of the boulder, quickly pulling back as another shot splintered the rock near his face. "I count 2 shooters. One on that ridge to the right, another behind those rocks ahead." "There were 4 sets of tracks," she reminded him. "The others must be with the cattle," he nodded. "These 2 stayed behind to discourage pursuit." Another volley of shots kept them pinned. Their position was exposed, with limited cover and no clear escape route. "We can't stay here," Beatrice said, checking her revolver. "They'll either flank us or wait until nightfall when we're blind." Hank assessed their options grimly. "I'll draw their fire. When they focus on me, you make a run for those trees along the stream bed." "And leave you here alone? Absolutely not." "Miss Alderson." "Beatrice," she corrected firmly. "If we might die together, you should at least use my given name." Despite the gravity of their situation, Hank felt an unexpected warmth at her words. "Beatrice," he conceded. "I'm trying to keep you alive." "And I'm declining your noble sacrifice," she replied. "I have another idea." She quickly outlined a plan that was either brilliant or suicidal. Hank was inclined toward the latter assessment, but their options were limited and time was running short. "That's a significant risk," he said after she finished. "Life is a significant risk, Mr. Prescott. Especially out here." Her eyes met his, unwavering. "Are you with me?" He should have said no. Every instinct built over years of survival screamed against it. Working together meant trusting her, and trust was a luxury he'd long ago discarded. "Hank," he said instead, "if we might die together, you should use my given name too." Her smile was brief but genuine. "Very well, Hank, on my count." What followed was a perfectly executed distraction. While Hank provided covering fire, Beatrice used a mirror from her pocket to flash sunlight into the eyes of one shooter. The momentary blindness was enough for Hank to land a shot that sent the man tumbling from his perch with a cry. The second rustler, seeing his companion fall, broke cover to retreat and took a bullet in the shoulder from Beatrice's carefully aimed revolver. They approached the wounded man cautiously. He was young, barely out of his teens, clutching his bleeding shoulder and regarding them with a mixture of pain and defiance. "Who hired you?" Hank demanded, keeping his Colt trained on the man's chest. "Nobody you'd know," the rustler spat. Beatrice stepped forward. "Perhaps not, but I suspect I would." Her voice was calm, almost conversational. "Was it Sullivan, or perhaps the Hendersons from over the state line?" The man's eyes flickered briefly at the second name, and Beatrice nodded as if he'd confirmed her suspicions. "The Hendersons," she said to Hank. "They've been trying to expand into Montana for years. My father blocked them repeatedly. And now they think you'll be easier to intimidate," Hank concluded. They bound the rustler's wound and tied him to his horse. The other man had died in the fall, and they recovered his body as well. "We won't catch the others before nightfall," Hank said, looking at the lengthening shadows. "They've got too much of a head start now." Beatrice nodded, the disappointment evident in her expression. "At least we know who's behind it." "That's something." They made camp by the stream, neither mentioning the fact that Hank had promised to return her to the ranch by sundown. Some unspoken shift had occurred between them during the firefight, a recognition of competence, perhaps, or a reluctant acknowledgement of compatibility. As they sat beside the small fire, the wounded rustler secured nearby, Beatrice studied Hank's profile in the flickering light. "You're not what I expected," she said finally. Hank raised an eyebrow. "What did you expect?" "Someone older." "More weathered," she smiled slightly. someone less willing to adjust his plans when a woman proposes a better strategy. Your strategy worked, he conceded, and you shot better than most men I've ridden with. High praise indeed, she said with a touch of irony. My father insisted I learn, said a woman alone in the West needs to handle a gun as well as any man. He was right. He usually was. She looked into the fire, her expression growing distant. Except about dying so young and leaving me to manage everything alone. The vulnerability in her voice created an uncomfortable tightness in Hank's chest. He'd spent years avoiding precisely this kind of moment, the quiet sharing that led to connection, that made people matter to each other. You're managing well, he offered awkwardly. Am I? She looked up, meeting his eyes directly. 15 head of cattle stolen, fence lines cut, and rustlers shooting at me seems like poor management. You're still fighting, Hank pointed out. Most would have sold and left by now. Is that what you do, give up when things got difficult? The question struck deeper than she could know. Hadn't that been exactly his approach to life? Not giving up perhaps, but certainly avoiding attachment to anything that could be taken away. I don't own anything worth fighting for, he said finally. Everyone should have something worth fighting for, she replied softly. Otherwise, what's the point of all this? Her gesture encompassed the wilderness around them, the vast territory they'd claimed as civilization. Hank had no answer. They finished their meal in silence, and he took the first watch while Beatrice slept, her back against a fallen log, face softened in repose. He found himself watching her more than the surrounding darkness, troubled by the unfamiliar feelings her presence evoked. The next morning, they started back toward the Alderson ranch, the wounded rustler's horse in tow, the dead man's body draped over his saddle. Beatrice rode tall despite the previous day's danger, her composure a testament to an inner strength Hank found increasingly difficult to ignore. They reached the ranch by midday. 2 young cowboys came running at their approach, expressions of relief turning to shock at the sight of their cargo. Miss Beatrice, we were about to form a search party, the taller one exclaimed. No need, Jim, she replied, dismounting smoothly. Mr. Prescott and I encountered some of our rustler friends. While the ranch hands dealt with the prisoner and the body, Beatrice led Hank to the main house. The interior was unexpectedly refined for a frontier ranch. Polished wood furniture, imported rugs, and shelves lined with books spoke of old money and Eastern connections. Your father built well, Hank observed as she poured him coffee in the kitchen. He brought my mother here as a bride from Boston, Beatrice explained. He promised her comfort even in the wilderness, and he kept that promise until the day she died. How long ago was that? I was 12, she said, a fleeting sadness crossing her features. Fever took her in the winter of '68. After that, it was just father and me. Hank accepted the coffee, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. And now just you. Yes, she sat across from him, her own cup cradled between her hands. Everyone expected me to sell after the funeral, move back east to my mother's family, or find a husband quickly. No one believed I could run this place. But you're proving them wrong. She smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. I'm trying, though days like yesterday make me wonder if they're right after all. Yesterday you outshot a professional rustler and helped capture one of the men stealing your cattle, Hank reminded her. I'd say that proves them wrong convincingly. Her genuine smile in response created an unfamiliar warmth in his chest. For a moment, they sat in comfortable silence, the connection between them strengthening despite Hank's instinctive resistance. I should get back to town, he said finally, setting down his empty cup. The cattle drive leaves at dawn. Of course, she nodded, standing. I've kept you from your preparations long enough. She walked him to the door, where he paused awkwardly. I'll inform the marshal about the Hendersons' involvement. He can send men to patrol your northern boundary until I return. When will that be? The question seemed to surprise her as much as it did him. 6 weeks if the weather holds, he replied. The association is driving 3,000 head to the railhead in Wyoming. She nodded, a hint of disappointment in her expression. Well, thank you for your assistance, Mr. Prescott. Hank, she corrected herself. I'm grateful. As he turned to leave, she added, be careful. The trail to Wyoming crosses Henderson territory in the south. Her concern touched him unexpectedly. I always am, he assured her. The ride back to town gave Hank too much time with his thoughts. He found himself repeatedly returning to moments from the previous day, Beatrice's steady hand with her revolver, her quick thinking during the ambush, the way morning light had illuminated her profile against the mountains. Dangerous thoughts, all of them. Attachment was vulnerability. Vulnerability got you killed. The mantra that had guided him for years felt suddenly hollow, insufficient to counteract the pull he felt toward Beatrice Alderson. He delivered the rustler to the marshal's office and provided a detailed report, emphasizing the Hendersons' involvement and the ongoing threat to the Alderson ranch. Thompson promised to increase patrols in the area and send a telegram to the territorial governor about the Hendersons' cross-border activities. The rest of the day passed in a blur of preparations. Hank checked his gear, purchased additional supplies, and met with the other men who would accompany the drive. Throughout it all, his mind repeatedly drifted back to the Alderson ranch and its determined proprietress. That evening, as he sat cleaning his guns in his small rented room above the livery, a knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. He opened it to find a young boy holding a small package. "Miss Alderson asked me to deliver this," the boy said, thrusting the package forward. "Said it's important." Hank gave the boy a coin and closed the door, examining the package curiously. It was wrapped in brown paper and tied with string, no larger than his palm. When he opened it, he found a small wooden heart, carved with intricate detail and polished to a smooth finish. A note accompanied it: "For luck on the trail, please don't ask why some things defy explanation. Return safely." But Hank stared at the wooden heart, turning it over in his fingers. It was beautifully crafted, the wood warm and smooth against his skin. The gesture confused him, stirring emotions he'd long suppressed. Why would she send this? What did it mean? Don't ask why, her note had specified. Some things defy explanation. He should have left it behind. Taking it meant acknowledging a connection, accepting something that could be a liability on the dangerous trail ahead. Instead, he slipped it into his pocket, where his fingers returned to it repeatedly throughout the evening, as if drawn by some invisible force. The cattle drive departed at dawn the next morning, a massive operation involving 20 riders and 3,000 head of cattle. As trail boss, Hank had little time for reflection during the grueling days that followed. The work was physically demanding and mentally exhausting, requiring constant vigilance against predators, rustlers, and the capricious nature of both weather and cattle. Yet in rare quiet moments, during his watch beneath star-filled skies, or when the herd moved steadily through peaceful valleys, his thoughts inevitably returned to Beatrice Alderson. More disturbing still was the wooden heart he carried, which had become a talisman of sorts. His fingers sought it instinctively in moments of stress or danger, drawing inexplicable comfort from its smooth contours. 3 weeks into the drive, as they approached the Wyoming border, Hank's vigilance intensified. This was Henderson territory, and while the size of their operation offered some protection, he wasn't taking chances. His caution proved warranted when 2 days later, 8 riders appeared on a ridge overlooking their noon resting spot. They made no aggressive moves, merely watching the herd from a distance, but the message was clear: they were being monitored. "Henderson men?" asked Miller, one of the more experienced drovers, as he rode up beside Hank. "Most likely," Hank nodded. "Double the watch tonight and keep the men alert. I don't want anyone wandering off alone." For 2 days, the watchers maintained their distance, appearing and disappearing at irregular intervals. On the 3rd night, as they made camp in a sheltered valley, Hank felt the tension building toward inevitable confrontation. His instincts proved correct when, shortly after midnight, shots rang out from the direction of the remuda. The horses panicked, several breaking free as shadowy figures moved among them. "Horse thieves," the cry went up from the night watchman as the camp erupted into activity. Hank organized a defense, positioning men to protect both the herd and the remaining horses while he led a small group to confront the thieves directly. The ensuing firefight was brief but intense. 2 of the thieves fell while the others retreated into the darkness. As dawn broke, they assessed the damage. 3 horses stolen, 1 drover wounded but not seriously, and 2 dead thieves who, upon examination, carried no identification but whose description matched Henderson Ranch hands. This was a message, Hank told Miller as they buried the dead men, a reminder that we're crossing their territory. "Or revenge for what happened at the Alderson place," Miller suggested. "Word travels fast out here." Hank frowned, his hand unconsciously finding the wooden heart in his pocket. If Miller was right, the connection to Beatrice had already put his men in danger. The very thing he'd spent years avoiding, vulnerability through attachment, had found him despite his precautions. The remainder of the journey passed without further incident, though Hank maintained heightened vigilance until they reached the railhead in Wyoming. The cattle were loaded onto trains bound for Chicago, the drovers paid, and arrangements made for the return journey. Standing on the platform watching the cattle cars pull away, Hank found himself at an unexpected crossroads. His obligation to the association was fulfilled. He could accept their next assignment, continuing the solitary existence he'd cultivated for years. Or he could return to Montana and face the uncomfortable truth that Beatrice Alderson had awakened something in him he'd long thought dead. The wooden heart seemed to grow heavier in his pocket, a physical manifestation of the choice before him. Don't ask why, she had written. Some things defy explanation. Perhaps some things didn't need explanation. Perhaps some connections were worth the vulnerability they created. The return journey to Montana Territory took nearly 2 weeks, longer than necessary, because Hank deliberately avoided the direct route through Henderson land. When he finally crested the ridge overlooking Timber Creek, the town appeared unchanged, a collection of wooden buildings clustered along a dusty main street. He stopped first at the marshal's office, where Thompson greeted him with obvious relief. "Glad to see you back in one piece," the marshal said. "Heard you had trouble with the Hendersons." "Nothing we couldn't handle," Hank replied. "Any word on the situation here?" Thompson's expression darkened. The rustlings continued. Not just at the Alderson place anymore either. 3 other ranches hit in the past month. "And Miss Alderson, has she had further trouble?" "More than her share," Thompson sighed. "Someone burned her north hay barn last week. Before that, they poisoned her well." He regarded Hank carefully. "She's not one to admit defeat, but she's fighting a losing battle out there alone." Hank nodded, a decision crystallizing. "I'll ride out there today." "Thought you might," Thompson said with the barest hint of a smile. "The association's been asking when you'll report for your next assignment. What should I tell them?" "Tell them I'm handling a personal matter," Hank replied, already turning toward the door. "Indefinitely." The ride to the Alderson ranch seemed both longer and shorter than he remembered. The landscape was changing with the approach of autumn, the fields golden in the afternoon light. As he approached the main house, he noted new damage: the charred remains of the hay barn to the north, a section of corral fence under repair, fewer cattle in the nearest pasture. Beatrice herself appeared on the porch as he approached, rifle in hand just as on his first visit. She wore a simple brown dress today, her honey-blonde hair loosely pinned, escaped tendrils framing a face more careworn than he remembered. "Mr. Prescott," she called, lowering the rifle, "you're back earlier than expected." He dismounted, removing his hat. "Hank," he reminded her, "the drive went smoother than anticipated." "Until the Hendersons found you," she said, surprising him. "News travels even out here." "We handled it." She nodded, studying him with those direct blue eyes that seemed to see more than he intended to reveal. "I'm glad. We've had our share of trouble here as well." "So the marshal mentioned," Hank gestured to the burned barn. "He said they poisoned your well too." "Among other things," she sighed, suddenly looking every bit as tired as she must have felt. "Would you like some coffee? It seems we have much to discuss." Inside, the house showed subtle signs of strain, fewer lamps lit to conserve oil, the pantry noticeably less stocked than during his previous visit. Beatrice moved efficiently in the kitchen, her posture betraying none of the fatigue he'd glimpsed earlier. "The Hendersons have escalated," she explained as she placed coffee before him. "Not just rustling now, but active sabotage. They've made offers through intermediaries to buy the ranch at half its value." "And you've refused." A flash of the old fire returned to her eyes. "Of course I've refused. This is my home." "Even as they slowly destroy it." She set her cup down with more force than necessary. "Did you ride all this way to suggest I surrender, Mr. Prescott?" "No," he replied, reaching into his pocket to withdraw the wooden heart. He placed it on the table between them. "I came to return this. And to ask why, despite your instructions not to." Her expression softened at the sight of the carving. "You kept it." "Yes." "Did it bring you luck?" "I'm here, aren't I?" A smile touched her lips briefly. "That doesn't answer my question about why you're here." Hank leaned forward, choosing his words carefully. For years, I've lived by a principle that attachment is vulnerability, and vulnerability gets you killed out here. It's kept me alive, but not much more than that. He touched the wooden heart with one finger. Then you gave me this, and suddenly I had something to lose, something that mattered. Her eyes widened slightly, but she remained silent, waiting. I've spent 6 weeks trying to understand what that means, he continued, and I still don't have all the answers, but I know I couldn't just collect my next assignment and ride away. Not without seeing you again. And now that you have, her voice was barely above a whisper, now I'm offering to stay, he said simply, to help you fight for what matters to you. Beatrice stared at him, a complex mixture of emotions crossing her face. Why would you do that? You barely know me. I know enough, he replied. I know you're brave and determined. I know you shoot straight and think clearly under pressure. I know you fight for what's yours, even when others say you can't win. He picked up the wooden heart, holding it between them. And I know that for reasons I still don't understand, you carved this for me and asked me to carry it. So now I'm asking why. For a long moment she was silent, her gaze dropping to the carved heart in his hand. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but steady. My father carved a heart like that for my mother when he first brought her west, she explained. He said that out here, where words are scarce and life is hard, sometimes you need something tangible to hold on to. A reminder that even in this harsh land, gentler things can survive. She met his eyes again. I gave it to you because in the brief time we spent together, I saw something in you that reminded me of him. A good man trying to pretend the world hasn't made him hard. A man who still has room in his heart for something beyond survival. Her honesty left him momentarily speechless. It was more than he'd expected, a level of insight that both unsettled and attracted him. I'm not sure I'm the man you think I am, he said finally. Perhaps not yet, she acknowledged with a slight smile, but you could be. The directness of her gaze challenged him to face truths he'd long avoided. In this woman he recognized not just strength but a willingness to remain open despite the risks, to fight for connection rather than retreat from it. I want to help you save your ranch, he said. Not just from the Hendersons but for the future, if you'll have me. As what exactly? She asked, and though her tone was light, the question carried weight. As whatever you need, he replied honestly. For now, a ranch hand, a gun, an ally. After that, he hesitated, unfamiliar territory stretching before him. After that, we'll see. She considered this, fingers lightly tracing patterns on the wooden table. The bunkhouse has an empty bed. The pay isn't much, especially now. I'm not concerned about pay. You should be, she said pragmatically. A man needs something of his own. I've managed with less, he assured her. She nodded slowly. Very well, Mr. Prescott, Hank. I accept your offer of assistance, at least until this situation with the Hendersons is resolved. It wasn't quite what he'd hoped for, but it was a beginning. He extended his hand and she took it, her grip firm and warm. One condition, he said, still holding her hand. You keep this. He pressed the wooden heart into her palm, closing her fingers around it, until I've earned the right to ask for it back. Her eyes widened slightly, understanding the implication. That may take some time. I've nowhere else I need to be, he replied simply. The following weeks transformed both the Alderson ranch and Hank himself. With single-minded determination, he set about strengthening their defenses, repairing damaged fences, training the young ranch hands in combat tactics, establishing regular patrols of the property boundaries. Word spread quickly that Hank Prescott, the association's most feared enforcer, had taken a personal interest in the Alderson ranch. Some of the pressure eased as smaller opportunists sought easier targets, though the Hendersons continued their campaign of intimidation. Throughout it all, Hank found himself drawn ever closer to Beatrice. They worked side by side during the days, planning strategy and managing the ranch's operations. In the evenings, they often shared meals in the main house, their conversations gradually extending beyond ranch business to personal histories, hopes, and philosophies. He learned that she had been educated in Boston until age 16, when she'd insisted on returning to Montana permanently. That she could play the piano beautifully, but preferred the practical skill of mending harnesses. That she had turned down 3 marriage proposals from suitable Eastern gentlemen because none of them understood her love for this wild country. In turn, he found himself sharing pieces of his own past that he'd kept buried for years. the memories of his mother's gentle voice. His father's stoic grief that had hardened into the lessons that shaped Hank's approach to life. The years of drifting before finding purpose with the association, purpose that had sustained him but never quite fulfilled him. You've spent so long protecting yourself from loss that you've almost forgotten how to live, Beatrice observed one evening as they sat before the fire. There's a difference between surviving and living, Hank. And you think you're living, he challenged gently. Isolated out here, fighting battles that never end. I'm fighting for something I believe in, she countered. That's living. The outcome matters less than the choice to engage fully in the struggle. Her words stayed with him, challenging the foundations of the philosophy that had guided him for so long. Gradually, he found himself reconsidering what it meant to be vulnerable, to care, to risk loss for the possibility of something greater. The confrontation with the Hendersons came sooner than expected. On a crisp October morning, as frost rimmed the grass, a group of 15 armed riders approached the main house. Hank had prepared for this possibility, positioning men at strategic points and ensuring Beatrice was safely inside. Joshua Henderson himself led the group, a barrel-chested man in his 50s with cold eyes and a reputation for ruthlessness. He reined his horse to a stop a cautious distance from the house, where Hank waited on the porch, Winchester in hand. "Prescott," Henderson called. "Didn't expect to find you playing ranch hand after all your years with the association." "I go where I'm needed," Hank replied evenly, "and it seems I'm needed here." Henderson's laugh held no humor. "A waste of your talents. This land will be mine one way or another. The girl can't hold it, even with your help." "You seem very confident for a man whose men keep failing," Hank observed. "2 dead trying to steal our horses. 3 more captured by the marshal after your last rustling attempt." Henderson's expression darkened. "Temporary setbacks. I've waited years for old Alderson to die so I could expand northward. I'm not about to let his daughter or her hired guns stand in my way." "Then you should have brought more men," Hank said calmly, as ranch hands appeared at various points around the property, all armed and positioned for crossfire. Henderson surveyed the situation with narrowed eyes, clearly reassessing his odds. "This isn't just about today, Prescott. You can't guard her forever. Winter's coming. Men need work elsewhere. Eventually you'll move on, and when you do, I'll be waiting." "I'm not going anywhere," Hank stated, the certainty of it settling in his bones as he spoke the words. "And neither is Miss Alderson." The ranch house door opened behind him, and Beatrice stepped out, a rifle held confidently in her hands. She wore a deep blue dress that emphasized the determination in her eyes as she took her place beside Hank. "Mr. Henderson," she greeted coolly, "I see you've decided to dispense with proxies and do your threatening in person. How refreshing." Henderson's gaze shifted between them, a new calculation evident in his expression. "I'm offering you one last chance, Miss Alderson. Sell to me now at a fair price or face the consequences." "I believe I've already faced many of your consequences," she replied. "Stolen cattle, burned buildings, poisoned wells. Yet here I stand, on land that remains mine." "You're making a mistake," Henderson warned. "A woman alone can't." "She's not alone," Hank interrupted, his voice carrying clearly to every man present. "And she never will be again, as long as I draw breath." The declaration hung in the air, its significance apparent to everyone present, including Beatrice, whose quick glance at Hank held surprise and something warmer. Henderson studied them both, reassessing the situation. Finally, he nodded curtly. "We'll see how long that lasts." He turned his horse, signaling his men to retreat. "This isn't over." "No," Hank agreed quietly, watching them ride away, "but it's changing." When the riders had disappeared from sight, Beatrice turned to him, her expression questioning. "Did you mean what you said, about me never being alone again?" Hank met her gaze directly, every word. Later that evening, after ensuring the ranch was secure, Hank found Beatrice sitting alone on the porch, wrapped in a shawl against the autumn chill. She looked up as he approached, making room for him on the bench beside her. "Henderson won't give up easily," he said as he sat down, "but he'll be more cautious now. He knows he's facing organized resistance." "Yes," she agreed. "Though I suspect what truly gave him pause was realizing he's facing not just hired guns, but a united front." She turned to face him fully. "That's what you meant today, isn't it? When you said I wouldn't be alone again." Hank nodded slowly, partly, but there was more to it than strategy. In the silence that followed, he gathered his courage. Years of avoiding vulnerability made this moment more terrifying than any gunfight he'd faced. When I came back, he began carefully, I told myself it was to help you save your ranch, and it was, but it was also because in those weeks away, I realized something I've been avoiding most of my life. And what's that? She asked softly. That safety isn't found in isolation, that the very connections I've feared might actually be what make life worth the risks we take. He met her eyes directly. That meeting you changed something fundamental in me, Beatrice. She remained still, her expression guarded yet hopeful. Changed what exactly? My belief that attachment is always vulnerability, he admitted. Sometimes it's strength, sometimes it's the very thing that gives us the courage to face whatever comes. Her hand found his on the bench between them, warm despite the cool evening air. That's quite an evolution in thinking for a man who was determined to remain unencumbered. I had a good teacher, he said with a slight smile. Someone who showed me that fighting for what matters is living, regardless of the outcome. Beatrice's expression softened. And what matters to you now, Hank? This, he said simply, gesturing to encompass the ranch, their joined hands, the moment between them. You, the possibility of a future where I'm not just surviving but truly living. She was silent for a long moment, her eyes searching his face as if confirming the truth of his words. Finally, she reached into her pocket and withdrew the small wooden heart, holding it between them. I've been carrying this since you gave it back to me, she confessed. A reminder that even in this harsh land, gentler things can survive. She placed it in his palm, closing his fingers around it. I think perhaps you've earned the right to ask for it back. Hank looked down at the carved heart in his hand, then back to Beatrice's expectant face. In her eyes, he saw not the vulnerability he'd feared for so long, but a strength born of openness, of willingness to risk heart and soul for what truly mattered. Beatrice Alderson, he said, his voice steady despite the thundering of his heart, I'm asking now not just for this heart but for yours, to protect, to cherish, to stand beside through whatever comes. Her smile bloomed slowly, transforming her face with a joy that took his breath away. You've had it for longer than you know, she replied, since the day you rode back to me instead of taking your next assignment. He leaned forward then, one hand still holding the wooden heart, the other rising to gently touch her cheek as he kissed her for the first time. It was a kiss of promise, of futures aligning, of two people who had found in each other not weakness, but the strength to face an uncertain world together. The winter of 1878 saw many changes at the Alderson Ranch. A small, quiet wedding in December, attended by the ranch hands and a few townspeople from Timber Creek. The marshal stood as witness, beaming with satisfaction at the union he'd inadvertently facilitated. The Hendersons made one final attempt in February, sending men to burn the main house while its occupants slept. They found instead a prepared defense that resulted in 2 more dead rustlers and a federal marshal's investigation that ultimately led to Joshua Henderson's arrest for multiple violations of territorial law. By spring, the ranch was flourishing under joint management. Hank's connections with the association brought additional protection and favorable contracts for their cattle. Beatrice's innovation and determination ensured the ranch not only survived but expanded. On their first anniversary, as they sat together on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson, Hank withdrew the small wooden heart from his pocket, turning it thoughtfully in his fingers. Do you ever think about that day you gave this to me, he asked, when you asked me not to ask why? Beatrice smiled, her head resting comfortably against his shoulder. Often. I was terrified you'd ignore my request and demand an explanation I wasn't ready to give. And now I'm grateful for your curiosity, she said, placing her hand over his, both of them cradling the carved heart. Some questions deserve to be asked, even when the answers aren't clear. I almost didn't ask, he admitted, almost rode away after the cattle drive back to the life I knew. She turned to face him, her blue eyes reflecting the last light of day. What changed your mind? I realized that the very thing I'd spent years avoiding, connection, vulnerability, the risk of loss, was the only thing that made me feel truly alive. He leaned forward to kiss her gently. You were right. There's a difference between surviving and living. And now, she asked, echoing his earlier question. He smiled, tucking the wooden heart back into his pocket where he still carried it daily. now we're doing both. Surviving and living together. As darkness settled over the Montana wilderness, they remained on the porch, wrapped in the shared warmth of a connection that had defied the harsh realities of frontier life. In the distance, coyotes called to one another across the valleys, their voices a reminder of both the wildness and the community that defined this untamed land. For Hank Prescott, who had once believed that attachment was vulnerability, the greatest revelation was this. In the heart of what he had feared most, connection, commitment, love, he had found not weakness but unimaginable strength. The small wooden heart he carried was no longer a reminder of risk, but of redemption, of a life transformed by the courage to ask why, and the wisdom to recognize when the answer mattered more than the question.